God. So the first thing I need to say, which I didn't put publicly on the text, is thank you to David, who below the level of the camera is a bit shaky as well, because whilst he's very happy to talk, talking on Zoom is not David's preferred medium. I think he said, can't we just invite them all over for a glass of wine, would have been his preference, but clearly that doesn't necessarily work. So thank you for doing this, and thank you to everybody turning up. I hope you'll take something useful from it, even if it's something you think about and then come back and talk to your other half about, or ask me questions. But if you want to ask any questions while we're going through, please feel free to ask. So we've agreed some of the stuff, because otherwise it could just be that we talk till Friday, and that wasn't the idea. We've agreed some of the main things that David wanted to be able to get over as a husband. And therefore I'm going to ask him some questions so that he can say it in his way. We didn't want to script this in any way, but we have scripted the questions. Hi, Tara. And Nikki. Is Nikki? Nikki, are you alone, or have you got your kids with you? Nikki.
Yeah, I've got a husband and my son as well.
Well done, Nikki's son, is what I wanted to say then, for turning up. Thank you. Hi, Lisa, and hi, Tara. Nice to see you. So for those of you who've just come in, this is David. And Joe's coming in too. So the first question that I asked, hi Lisa, David, and hi Joe, I asked David to explain to you is, I guess, what are the three most important things, or the key things, that he felt he wished he had known sometime earlier, or that he understood about me going into the menopause? So David.
Thank you. I can't just start off by saying I'm no expert on this, and therefore I don't think I expect I know a heck of a lot more than many of you guys there as well, if you see what I mean. But we do talk about it a lot, so perhaps I get a bit more feedback about some of the stuff behind it. And for me, despite being married to an expert on this, one of the things that I had no real concept was really the depth and breadth of the impacts of going through the menopause for Sam, and how broad and wide that can impact on sort of every aspect of your life. And whilst you can sort of read a list of this sort of stuff, I don't think I really understood how it might affect sort of day-to-day life with us. And I'm not going to go through that whole list and explain that sort of day-to-day life stuff, because I wouldn't dare mention the list, because I've been missing out a couple and I'll get a kick under the table. But suffice to say that I don't think I had any idea of that. The second bit really was important for me, but that's I did do a science degree when I was younger, is it was really helpful for me to understand the actual physical science behind it. Now, a lot of people hate science, but for me, knowing that there was actually a physical and chemical reaction causing much of this was very helpful for me to sort of recognize this wasn't just, don't hit me for saying this, Sam being a bit of a pain on certain occasions or being a bit difficult, that actually there was real science behind why she was acting as she was. And that for me was, I think, a good start for a point of empathy, should we say. And then thirdly, and not terribly relevant, I suspect, to most of you, but at the time I was responsible for managing 550, 600 people. And I had no real concept of some of the implications. And I look back on that with some embarrassment that I didn't know what I know now, and therefore didn't perhaps put in place within the workplace some of the things that I feel I ought to have, or I should take more effort to do so. Fortunately, I was working for the police, so most of my staff were fairly young profession. So hopefully it wasn't too difficult for too many of the people working, but I really do wish I'd had some better knowledge about that before. So they're my three key bits for me that I just kind of wish I'd understood a bit better then than I do now, if you see what I mean.
A couple of months ago, David had come home from work, and he was doing some work for, I think it was the HIV investigation that you're working at now. And there was a new lift put in to help people with disabilities get from one floor to another. And you and a couple of other people needed to know, in the event of an emergency, how to get somebody in that lift and down. And David said, I explained it to this lady, and she sort of understood it. And by the next day, that processing, that information that he had explained to her gently, a lady clearly sort of our sort of age in the menopause, she didn't get it at all. And you said, but now you understood why she wasn't able to process that information, whereas perhaps 5 or 6 years ago, you would have thought, for goodness sake, I only explained that to you yesterday. Do you remember that?
Yeah. It was actually an evacuation stair lift, and it's got 2 controls on it, sort of go and stop. I mean, nicely, in a slightly facetious way, it can't be that tricky, but in fact, it did prove to be a bit trickier than I thought.
But so that was a fairly recent example. So what would you say are the key things you've noticed about me going through my menopausal journey? Because what I noticed is, apparently, this is quite an interesting conversation to what you've noticed.
I think the first thing I noticed or didn't notice was the start.
Yeah.
And not a Scooby-Doo. We loosely talked about menopause, particularly following some of the sort of courses and the stuff and the background reading that Sam's done. But I think, in honesty, I misread what the start was, thinking that Sam was a bit stressed by work. She was a little bit quick to anger, working a bit too hard, too much pressure going on there. And that was causing a degree of angst, irritation, making sometimes a little more challenging at home. And I think really the bit where it really came to a head was actually driving somewhere in a car together, where she was just completely ludicrously, in my opinion, fearful about driving other cars coming towards us, all that sort of stuff. And that fear of having an accident or going into the back of another car was really quite unreasonable in comparison to sort of what we've done, driven like all our lives, if you see what I mean. And I think that was one of the key points for us, actually, and a key turning point where we just stopped and started discussing it in a bit more detail and recognized that actually was probably one of the symptoms that was causing it at that point, that sort of keyed us into thinking, actually, for me, that it's now here, and it's not sort of some sort of, it's going to happen and I'm just going to look out for the hot flush when it comes and hope that'll be it, because we didn't see any of that sort of thing for yonks later. So for me it was just, I had no idea that it wasn't just normal being a bit stressy at work kind of stuff, and that it was already impacting way into our lives, probably perhaps
5 years ago.
For some time.
I have told you about the driving issue and how difficult that got for me, and I know some of you have said that you notice it. It was only when I said something like, David, I'm actually scared. And he would say, but if I didn't do that, that woman would have driven into us or something. It was only when we broke that conversation down to him realizing how terrified I was, that we were able to move forward on that, because I was literally grabbing the door handle the whole time, or my foot was braking on an imaginary brake in the car. And it just became really stressful for you, apart from anything else, didn't it? It
was like driving with my 87-year-old mother, I'll be honest with you. But, anyway, the other bit actually I noticed was, if I ever gave a directions to where to go or where to meet, it was the sort of the inability of her to convert the directions into actually the right place to meet exactly where you took, no matter how many times you went through it. It just didn't seem to compute with her. But it was those, and it sounds a bit facetious to say some of this stuff, but actually those are the things you notice, and they're often the things that key you into a bit of frustration, a bit of irritation, a bit of anger, if you know what I mean, which is fairly unhelpful to the process, I suppose, really. So that was the key. That was the things I think that really when we started to actually identify it as a impacting on our daily lives.
So I guess I have, this sounds loaded and it's not meant to be loaded. What advice would you give to other guys going through still? Yeah, it's interesting. We talk about this. Our oldest children are 32. In 5-8 years' time, the girls could potentially be starting to notice some of the very, very early signs. We talk about this as if our children are like way beyond it. And I think our children will be so much better prepared. But so what is your advice potentially to a guy his wife, other half, sister, mum, or whatever is going into this? What would you say has worked for us?
I could say I don't have any advice for you in that sense, in the sense that I'm not suggesting what you should do. I could tell you what I found really helpful. And I think what's saved us a lot of problems, a lot of angst, and slightly boringly, it was the ability to have that conversation and have that open conversation about how it was impacting on her and how that made her behave towards me and elsewhere. In some ways, it was sort of exasperated by the fact that Sam seemed to be operating very effectively at work, and then she'd save all up the frustration and the sort of the niggly bits and share them with me, which was a treat. But it was perhaps one of the reasons why I didn't recognize them quite as early as I might have recognized them otherwise. But and that conversation, you know, it's your hormones, dear, sort of is sort of just like the way that you're going to get a slap around the ear hole. And so that lead into how you have that conversation is only something that nicely you guys are going to have to work out yourselves, because it was bloody tricky even for us. And, you know, I would say that we started off from a very knowledgeable point of view. And even then it was a sensitive, tentative movement into talking about some of the issues. But I think that led on quite well to talking about some changes in behavior and what have you. And there was a time sort of 5 or 6 years back where I was working long hours and really quite stressed with work, where I actually recognized in some ways some of the behaviors I was seeing in Sam, in fact, was probably me when I was in the most stressy parts of my working life, where you come back, you know, you go out at 6 o'clock in the morning, you come back at 8 o'clock, you're tired, knackered and stressed, and you've had a hard day being nice to people all day, and you sort of don't have the time, don't have the energy or the intellectual capacity to be a bit more reasonable, a bit more sort of on board when you get in. And that's a bit like how it felt, actually, from my point of view. But that conversation initially, and then we still do now, we still now regularly sort of talk about some of the issues and how they're impacting where they come to the fore. And I because it's easy to have, you can get away with having a conversation once, but it's that repetitive on going back to it, just keeping it fresh, just saying, and it's changed. Some of the stuff's changed as we've gone on. Some of the different impacts, the way it's worked. So I mean, to me, that's the only advice I can say that could be important for you to understand what the impacts can be, and then how it's manifesting, and then that ability to talk about it.
David said, which I hadn't really realized, and you only said this fairly recently, that when I've done something fairly unreasonable and he gently says, do you think this is just part of your stress? Not, is that your hormones, but do you think this is part? And I say, yeah, you're right, I was unreasonable. And yes, that is probably that. Then it makes him feel so much better, that almost like I've taken ownership for being overly stressful about something because it just happened on the wrong day at the wrong time or whatever. And that's been really helpful for you.
I think the admission that sometimes you're being unreasonable,
Yeah.
and I'm not trying to be unfair, but
No.
when you have admitted it and you do recognize it, and you say, and look back, say, yeah, perhaps I was quite unreasonable then, I find that hugely helpful to sort of perhaps not react too strongly when it's going on. I found that immensely helpful.
So obviously I've dragged David along the sort of eating and exercise route. Not that David's a runner and he enjoys cycling, so we've always enjoyed good food, but we did want to just say that there have actually been huge benefits of you slightly, he hasn't got a glass of wine with him on purpose, but of me sort of perhaps being a little bit more controlling about the way that we eat and what we eat and the way that we drink. What's your take on that?
Some good bits and some bad bits, I'll be honest with you. I think, you know, see, I'm coming towards 60, and I recognize that I probably drank a little bit too much too often, and I probably ate a bit too much too often, and so I need to work on it. And actually going for a healthy diet, it all sort of joking aside, I do like doing a bit of exercise. I found really helpful for me to feeling good about myself. In fact, there's 3 areas we do. It's healthy eating, a lot of exercise, and because Sam, the sleep aspect of this is so important, we actually end up going to bed quite early. And actually find the combination of three of those, I'm as least stressed as I've ever been in my life. So,
yeah, retirement suits
but I
you.
have retired as well, so that does help quite a lot. Yeah, actually it's been quite fun, and particularly, you know, knowing that sort of from 45, 50 onwards we lose a lot of upper body strength. It's been quite fun doing some different stuff as well, because that's very relevant for, you know, fitness and health for you ladies going through this, and actually it's exactly the same relevant area for men actually going through that. So, you know, I'd never really done weightlifting since I was at university, so to start doing some weights and to do some upper body work has been actually really, really interesting. I really quite enjoyed it. So I kind of I've really quite enjoyed all the sort of those three key aspects of supporting Sam a bit, I suppose, through the process. Actually, it's been pretty good for me, actually, if you like that kind of stuff. We do drink slightly different timescales. My weekend's slightly longer than Samantha's, if you know what I mean.
And your glasses are a bit bigger than mine.
Potentially.
Anybody want to ask any questions or make any comments? We are both really open to chatting or answering your questions. Anybody want to say anything? Female or male? You girls know me quite well, and I know the guys are just absorbing information. Anybody want to say anything?
Sarah's on the half. Quick question from my side. David talked a little bit about the discovery process as you started the identifying, you know, the move towards and into the early stages of the menopause. I guess from my point of view, I'm interested in maybe what the next stages are going to be, and how it evolves over time.
Shall I answer that then, just so you get a
honest answer?
So you get an honest answer. I think the stages of the perimenopause, which is the bit leading up to periods completely stopping, can last between 5 and 15 years. And literally every 2 years, there is a slight change. And I think that change goes up and down depending on how stressed you are, how stressed your life is, you know, whether there's financial stresses. Sarah runs her own business. She's got lots on her plate. You've got the kids, and I know you're, you know, juggling them, taking them to school. So I think that the stresses change, but there does come a point, and because hopefully all of the girls here have really taken time to identify what's important to them, eventually you get to a stage where you're living a life where it's really not too bumpy all of the time. So I'm 58. I think I probably started noticing, looking back, things were happening when I was about 51, 49 to 51, something like that. And really the times that are bad now for me, Sarah's husband, I've forgotten what your name, and I should know your name, but anyway, are when there's particular stressful events. And because of COVID and having elderly parents that were ill over Christmas, or we were talking when the whole business went online completely 18 months ago, and I had 10 days to basically write a new business plan and turn everything online. That was a particularly high point or bad point. So there's sort of ebbs and flows. But generally, I think you do reach what becomes a happy medium, a happy normal. Would that be fair to you to say happy? Is that word?
Yeah, I mean, happy. I mean, this bit about the fluctuation, I think, in the early stages and throughout it is quite relevant, because it gets quite hard to sort of really be clear. And I don't think you ever will be 100% clear what is caused by this and what isn't, what's sort of normal day-to-day life.
Yeah.
But I do notice that any fluctuations in the normal states, generally speaking, if it's a severe stress or something like that, it does impact on you. You will regress sort of into some of those behaviors more readily.
But I guess coming back to the second point that you made about the science side of it, is the chemical changes and the fundamental driver for the changes that everybody sees as they go through the menopause, are they transitory, or is it a permanent change to a different sort of makeup which you then sort of adjust your lifestyle and learn to live with? effectively.
So in effect, women postmenopausally are estrogen depleted. And unless you put that estrogen back in, they remain estrogen depleted. Now, if we lived the kind of life that meant that you were wandering down a lovely sunny beach wearing white linen trousers without any cares in the world, you can function quite happily being estrogen depleted. But as soon as we add in the stresses of being, parents and grandparents and work and all of that, it becomes really hard to function as an estrogen depleted woman. So that's why HRT is often seen as something that nobody's ever going to give up once they've started taking it, or perhaps as a bridge to get you to the other side. Does that answer that question?
Yeah, no, that's really good. I mean, that for me, sort of, it sounds as if the solution is within your own hands, and courses like this are fundamental to understanding the issue and advancing your ability to manage the changes in I guess the chemical balance.
Yeah, that's right. Which is why, daily exercise of some description, it doesn't need to be long, which is why going out for a walk, which is why perhaps rediscovering hobbies that you used to have either together or alone, all of those things, they calm your sensory nervous system down, which means that you're less stressed, which means you have less side effects. Stress and lack of sleep are massive for women, but we're often so stressed and so tired we don't see it, and that's one of the problems. Any other questions, comments? Hetty? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Martin. I'm Hetty's husband. Dave, I was very interested to hear you say something that it helped you a lot when Sam, as it were, took ownership for some of the irritation that you were perhaps on the receiving end. And obviously, we all try to be sensitive and aware of any people who are under stress, whether it's at work or with our children or with people who are very tired or very frightened. And therefore, I'm not drawing an exact parallel between just ordinary stress and menopausal stress. But why is it, do you think, Sam, that you can sometimes cope with it at work and presumably not lash out at or become irritated with everyone around you at work, or perhaps you do, I don't know. But if you don't do it at work, why is it, do you think, that at the end of the day, or even the beginning of the day, those who are nearest and dearest are most likely to be in receipt of double barrels on things that, other people, I mean, I'm lucky I've never suffered from the menopause and probably won't. I do sometimes get stressed, although I'm fairly lucky that I'm sort of fairly chilled about most things and do lots of exercise and drink enough to cope with the stresses. So how is it that taking ownership is improving things for the couple when the man is always going to be on the receiving end of the stressful actions and words?
So I'll answer that from my point of view, because obviously the question had two angles. Why am I able to cope with the work stress? I suppose with work stress, I know the tasks that I have to do that day and that time. And there's a lot of them and a lot of people and targets and things to keep happy. So if David says, did you take the soup out of the freezer? I can just think, that's one more thing for me to do. And it can just literally be enough to tip me from being quite in control to, of course, I didn't take the effing soup out of the freezer. And it can literally go like that. And so when David understandably gets upset because he's asked me to do something that's going to take 30 seconds, the fact that I acknowledge that I reacted unkindly and ridiculously, I think calms any potential fallout thereafter. But why do I react that way? I think, in honesty, it's because when my brain is juggling certain things that I've got to do, I find it quite hard to deviate off and get the soup out of the freezer, because otherwise I'm going to miss something. So I think there's quite a lot in my answer, really. So it's not particularly to give you a clear answer, but yours?
Well, there's two other bits. I think the first bit is it sort of follows on a bit from the last answer for me. I to a certain extent, and I'll probably get kick under the table for saying this, but
You must be quite bruised.
all right. If you look at the sort of process, and I think as you go into it, sort of the problem, the difficulty level, not problem, but the challenges you face as a couple perhaps build up a little bit, and they get a little bit more challenging until the steady state, I think we talked about the response to the last question, where you get your hormones balanced, you got your lifestyle change that suits the difficulties you're going through now. Actually, for me, that's a period of time that most of the time things are great, and really positive, and that it's not like don't want you to feel that I'm suffering or under the thumb all the time. You know, it's actually good, it's very positive. But I think there's some phases and some times where it does become a little challenging, and it's in those difficult times when you also get a bit peed off with these things that sort of openness and what have you is quite handy. And that's the bit about separating work and home. If I'm honest with you, you know, what I used to do was I used to get really quite stressful, and there was sort of life and death stuff, you know, decisions making, and you turn it on, you put the act on for work, and then when you come away from work, that's it. There's nothing left in the tank. You're just exhausted and empty, and it's the nature of a relationship. You always let your loved ones, you know, see a bit more of the negative side than anyone else in some ways. I suppose. Well, perhaps I do. I suspect I'm not entirely alone in that.
Does that answer your question, Mr. Hetty?
Yeah, I get it. Can I make an observation that I hope you won't think's facile? Hetty's now going, oh my God, what's this coming? You said something about when you were juggling 30 things in your head and the question comes, have you taken the soup out of the freezer? No, I fucking haven't taken soup. There's just one thing extra. Why is it that as this is a generalization, but why is it that ladies seem to have to carry 30 things in their head at once and try and jiggle and juggle them from the moment they wake up in the morning? Why is it they do that? So, you know, Hetty will wake up and, you know, quite within half an hour will have reeled off perhaps 30 different things that we need to do. Have I done this? Did I do this? Was I going to be doing this? And I'm going, I don't know. I haven't got to that part of the day yet. You know, at the moment, I'm just waking up. I know I've got my work planned. I know that we need to do shopping, so we'll need to make a list, but I don't need to have them all juggling in my head at the same time, so that if I then am asked to take the soup out of the freezer, I probably could cope with doing that, because it's one question when there's only probably one other thing going on in my head at the time. Do you think it's motherhood, that because you've been a mother, you have to jiggle and juggle so many things that you constantly have got in the habit of having everything there?
I think it is partly. I think
I was going to say, Martin, I think that's a cracking question, because I'd love to know the answer too.
I think, yes, I wouldn't necessarily say motherhood, but I think that perhaps the roles that a lot of us have played have meant that we've juggled things. One of the things I think I asked us girls fairly recently is, do you, now, particularly those of us with older children, do you get a funny feeling in your tummy at 4 o'clock that says you need to be home? Because that was the point at which the kids had to be home from school. You were getting their supper, you were making sure their homework was ready. You know, is their rugby kit clear, ready for my children haven't been at prep school for goodness knows how many years. So there's some kind of internal clock in our brains, I think, which means that by relating all the things we've got to do that day, somehow we feel better. And we feel very good telling you what we've got to do that day. And you can just say, lovely. And we still feel very good, even if we only write down the top 3 things that are important, which is what we all try and do. So I think it's probably part of the way our brains compute, actually. And I'm not going to profess to be a psychiatrist or a psychologist, but I've worked with women for 25 years or something. And I think most of us do it. And sometimes it drives me up the wall that he can't tell me what he's got to do, because I'd like to know what he's got to do too. And then I can worry about that as well.
See, I'm not the only one.
It's also not only just the list bit, actually. If I say to Sam, oh, do you know what the date is? She thinks I'm giving her another task to go and research, look up the date, find out what the day of the week, what date it is. Oh, it's the 4th or whatever. That's another job I've just added onto a list. Not, no, I can't remember, which is a fine answer for me as far as I'm concerned. But I've just asked a simple question. Do you know what the date is off the top of your head? But
yes, I think we need to fix things. I think we're inherent.
We are fixers.
Yes,
It's what we do.
yeah. I've even stopped my car with a girlfriend when somebody had broken down and asked if I could help. I've got no idea about what to do with a broken down car. Why the hell did I stop? I thought I might fix it. So we're inherent fixers. Does anybody else have an answer to that really good question from a female point of view? Because it's not just me. Anybody else want to say anything? Beverly, you've unmuted.
I think we are always trying to work out everything that's going on so that we can cope with it, because we have so many things to do. And I find that if in our household it's much the same, but if I didn't think about all those things, they wouldn't happen.
Absolutely.
Even though my husband is very good at joining in and he's very good at cooking and shopping, and it's not that he leaves it all to me, but he often leaves the thinking to me.
Yes, I think maybe we would say, Beverly, that things won't happen in the way that we want them to happen at that time.
There's an element of that too.
So we can be quite controlling, can't we?
Definitely. Yeah, so there is that.
It is an interesting. Sarah, are you going to say something?
I'm just going to say, I think I've been thinking about this since I've been doing the program with you, and I think I kind of rate myself on how many things I can get through, and whether I'm successful at doing things. The children ask me continuously where things are, and I continuously tell them where they are, rather than getting them to go and look for them themselves. I have started to, but I think I probably, if I can't get through all those things, then I feel kind of that I've not done a good job, or I've failed or something. So I think we kind of, sorry, the dog's coming in a really bad moment. But yeah, so I think I probably just judge myself on what I can achieve, which is why I've probably got so many things in my head.
Yeah, we do take too much control instead of letting other people get on with it.
Yeah, and I get very frustrated with John. In fact, I did today, didn't I? I ask him questions and he just tells me he doesn't know.
Fair answer, really, I'll be honest, isn't it?
How can you not know? Whereas I feel if he asks me a question, I should know.
What date is it? Oh, I've now got to tell you what the date is. Yeah.
So in the end, I've said, well, if you don't know anything, when you ask me something, I'm going to say I don't know either.
But maybe, Sarah, try it, because maybe this is our problem, not theirs.
I don't know. I said, well, we were talking about the scholarship for the school, weren't we? We were talking about what the school needed by the 7th of January. And John just said, I don't know. And that was it. Well, okay, well, we need to know. Hey.
I mean, there is no doubt women are from Mars and men are from Venus. We are different, aren't we?
Yeah, we are. We just wired differently.
Very much so. And from my perspective, sometimes I feel like I could say a one-word answer would suffice.
Yeah, you are more like that than me. Yeah, whereas I will make quite a long sentence.
Anybody else got anything, any other input about any of this, or questions that they'd like to ask?
I suppose more observation input rather than question, but I think as we do take on a lot, I think, in females in the household, and I think from my point of view, sometimes I don't know whether it's a trust issue. If I want something done, I do it myself because I know it's done properly. But I could be giving a lot more, sharing tasks and chores a lot more to the kids to to Tom. You do.
I mean,
You do a lot.
No,
You
no,
do a
and
lot.
I actually agree from the
Yeah.
kids' point of view. It is because you just know that if you leave them to do it, you'll only have to go and do it again.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you know, I suppose you have to take that step back and say, well, if they don't get it wrong the first time, they won't learn how to do it properly the next time. But and I think, I mean, coming back to sort of think this thing about having a million things on your mind and men generally not. I mean, in my view, the way that I rationalize it is that, you know, I have set periods of time in which I worry about things. And like Mike said, you know, when I wake up in the morning, that's not my time to worry about what I'm going to be doing at work later that day. I'm just getting up in the morning. And then when I get to sort of, you know, 8 o'clock or I'm sitting on the train into London, then I think, right, now what are my tasks for the day? And that's when I worry about it. And then when I've finished the work and then I come home, then I think about these are the things that I have to do at home. And I don't carry all these things around in my mind all the time because I don't need to worry about all those things. I only sort of sit. And maybe that's a symptom of me, you know, I only see what's sat in front of me, and when it presents a problem, then I fix it, but I don't think about the problems that I've got to worry about tomorrow if I don't have to worry about them until tomorrow. And that's how I just.
So do you think there's a demarcation that if you actually go out of the house to go to work, that's when you sort of, your brain switches on and into that mode, whereas when you're in the house, you're in husband, dad, you know, domestic mode. You know, I think there's something more about people, more of us are working from home, so our brains are constantly in that mode, whether you go from your study into another room but you're constantly in that mode. I wonder if there's a little bit there, isn't there?
Oh, that's definitely true. When I used to go to work in London almost 2 years ago now, I was at work. I wasn't thinking about home. I wasn't thinking about dinner. None of that was going on in my head. I was just focused on work. And now I work from home. It's you leave the office and you go downstairs and you start to think about these things. And yeah, it's very different now. But yeah, I suppose out of work time, yeah, I suppose I was just saying, I would wish I could compartmentalize what you were talking about. I wish I could not, you know, have set times when I think about things. But for me, that's like a machine. It doesn't work that way. It's always lots of stuff. And I also think ahead a lot more than you do, perhaps. Like booking the next holiday, or, you know, what the children, you know, school stuff, university. It's always forward thinking ahead. And that's what I tend to worry about planning. Yeah, it's very different set of skills, which I think it works well actually, because if we were all forward planning and not thinking about here and now, it wouldn't work as a team, I think. And yeah, I think people need to be different and not the same to get on together.
So I think really, Tara, what I would say is all of that stuff is stuff that's got to go on in life generally, but when our hormones are going up and down, we find that much harder and we don't communicate that as well. So something which was working quite happily, you know, for 10, 15, 20 years suddenly becomes more of an issue, and it becomes harder for us to work in that way, whereas they haven't got the same changes going on, and so it can suddenly appear to all go very wrong, and that may be more highlighted.
I think as a female, I mean, I'm more emotionally you know, more emotional when it comes to doing things, and you're more logical, aren't you? And that's fine, but then when you throw in kind of your hormones changing too, and you become more emotional, and you have to watch that you don't become so emotional that you can't actually kind of achieve anything.
or it becomes more difficult to relate to each other.
Because you come from completely different places.
The changes aren't moving us closer together. I think it's probably the opposite direction. And so I think certainly as a husband, I'm trying to go that way as well. But you know, without the tools to understand it, it's sometimes quite challenging.
I think by turning up here tonight and being prepared to sit with Sarah, and you know, for all of you just to be here, I think that's a massive step forward. This is the first time we've talked in this way to other couples. And you know, there is no doubt everybody can say that communication helps everything, but rather than communicating once about it, having open ongoing conversations, not talking about the menopause all the time, but just, you know, why did I react like that, or this is how that made me feel, rather than you did, There's a very different conversation, and that can be really helpful. Liz, did you want to say anything? Or are you happy up there not saying anything?
Yeah, no.
Fine.
Absolutely
fine. Yeah.
Everything's been very relevant. What other people have said, really.
I'll just have a quick question. I mean, Sam, you were saying that when you reached 49 or 50, you noticed that you had the menopause for the first time, but there's sort of no line in the sand as to when that happens.
No.
So how do you distinguish between what is menopausal stress and what is just normal stress? Because as we get older, we tend to have more serious stresses in our life in any case, like elderly parents, which we've got, and difficult children, health problems, etc. And so that's going to cause you natural stress in any case, or is it just an accentuation of the natural stress, which you have to recognise and talk through your partners?
It's the inability to deal with those stresses as you have done thus far, so that the stress has become a bigger thing. I'll answer your question in another way. The UK's leading, or only just leading at the moment, menopause doctor is a lady called Louise Newson. I met her about 3 years ago at a conference in London. She had teenage girls, I think they were sort of 13 and 15 at the time where I met her. And she was at that point, before she became really famous, she was a menopause GP. And she was working with women day in, day out, helping them, putting them onto HRT, identifying their issues. And she said it was her 16-year-old daughter who said, you know, Mum, all these people that you talk to and all the things they say they're going through, has it occurred to you that that's what's happening to you at the moment? And she said she honestly didn't realize, she did not realize right in front of her nose, that was what was going on with her. She was so wrapped up in helping everybody else that she hadn't reflected on the fact that she was showing all of those symptoms as well. So I think if she can get to that point, being an expert in her field, it's very, very difficult for most women to have any line in the sand, as you say. Menopause is what's known as a retrospective diagnosis. Oh my God, do you remember when X, Y, and Z happened? That must be why I reacted like that, or why I suddenly lost my confidence, or why I suddenly didn't want to do this, that, or the other. I've got ladies that I've coached in a running group who told me they stopped wanting to go on holiday because they were nervous of flying. Looking back, they realized that they were doing things that avoided them doing things. I stopped driving on the motorway on the M25 at night because they got too scared. They were doing anything to go another way round. Looking back on it, they now know that that was one of the early things. So it is difficult.
Equally, I think you could probably look at it the other way, because we do get those life stresses in, and you could look perhaps at menopause as a multiplier of the impact. If you haven't got your menopause sort of sorted and a balanced footing, it just multiplies the factors of the other stresses coming into life. So it becomes impossible perhaps to deal with them where you would have dealt with them before.
I had a question as well. So I think we've sort of discussed the sort of emotional and the neurological, impact of menopause. But I mean, I appreciate there's over 100 different symptoms. But what sort of physical symptoms are there? I know weakened bones, etc. But what are the other sort of leading sort of physical manifestations that Cara may sort of feel or suffer from?
Yeah, great question. So the lack of estrogen means, as you said, your bones become more porous. So the way I always describe it is, if you cut a Whisper bar in half and you cut an Aero bar in half, a Whisper bar's got tiny little bubbles and an Aero bar's got bigger bubbles, and your bones become more like an Aero bubble. So if you fall without estrogen, you're much more likely to get a fracture. And fractures lead to long-term health decline. So that's one of the big ones. Once we hit, I think it's 62, a woman's lack of estrogen puts her at the same risk of cardiac disease as a man. Most people know that men are more likely to have heart attacks or cardiac diseases. Until we're about 60, 62, we're much less likely. But as soon as our estrogen plummets, that risk becomes about equal. Our risk of some diabetes and other allied things that go with heart disease goes up because estrogen doesn't protect us. So there's sort of longevity risks. Being a little careful about how I explain this, but basically everything becomes a bit drier. Your tear ducts don't work as well. Your mouth can become dry. Everything becomes dry. And that in effect means that things can become quite uncomfortable. And women often don't want to talk about that. They find it really embarrassing. And it's only when somebody like me is really open about that conversation that they, oh, wow, okay. And there's something really simple I can do and it changes it. So there are 38 symptoms. And then we go down to tiny things like tinnitus, hair loss or hair growth. All of those things make a woman feel like, you know, really they lose their confidence. Your skin gets dry. There's umpteen symptoms. You get itchy, dry skin when you never had things like that before. Alcohol affects you massively and not in a good way. Hot flushes and night sweats. So put yourself into a work situation. There you are about to deliver an important presentation, either in person or online. You get slightly stressed, which could be excited because stress and excitement are on the same thing. And suddenly you've got sweat dripping down between your boobs. And now the blue silk blouse that you're wearing under your blazer actually looks wet. And so, of course, the embarrassment is huge. And then you forget your boss's name. So I could go on and on and on. But so there are some big health implications, but there's some real sort of confidence issues because of all the other things which may be seen as being minor, but they're not at all. And lack of sleep, I guess. Do you want me to keep going or is that enough?
That's good. That's good.
Any other questions or comments? Lisa, do you want to say anything? Are you happy absorbing this? You're a good absorber.
No, I think it's been really interesting. I don't think Joanne has any questions. Do you have anything you want to ask? The thing I'd say that is really interesting about this is that all the husbands and partners who are listening to this, and it's just fantastic. And David, thank you so much for talking to us about what it felt like from your perspective. What's a good way to get that information out there so that partners are perhaps more aware of it earlier on in the journey rather than after the women perhaps have worked out what's going on and tried to do something about it, and just in terms of information, because obviously our partners we have all talked to, but there are loads of men out there who are not aware of it.
I think what started this conversation between us, Lisa, was that until a woman really understands what's going on, how on earth can she expect anybody else, man or otherwise, in her life to understand? So the starting process, as far as I'm concerned, needs to be to properly educate and support women. Menopause education is now mandatory in schools. So in secondary education, there is going to be some menopause education. Outwardly and publicly, I have to say, whoopee-doo, that's a great thing. Inwardly and at home, I'm not entirely sure how many teenagers in secondary education will really, really benefit from that. But I also think that it's really important having these conversations at home with your kids around, and they go, for goodness sake, I don't want to know, but they'll take a little bit on and then a little bit on and a little bit on. And over time, that will be a really beneficial thing. I think drip feeding the information. But I think I started working in this world, this area about 8 years ago, where I could never say vagina on LinkedIn. And things have changed massively over a period of time, and that's good. But I think, Lisa, over the next 2 years, I think the conversation will become much more open. I think that you girls wouldn't have been comfortable to come to this until you really trusted me. So I do think we've got to have a female trust issue before we can encourage any man to sit and listen to this stuff, because I think it's quite difficult, isn't it?
Can be.
Yeah.
Wouldn't argue.
It's not easy.
So I don't know whether this is really wholly relevant, but I mean, I'm an architect and I design workspaces. And at the moment, we're going through a whole sort of process of understanding neurodiversity and how, you know, we design spaces and places for people with, you know, different, who are neurodivergent, atypical. But how, from dealing, or from sort of, you know, creating a space that's, you know, welcome and inviting for people, you know, for women who are menopausal, are there certain things that you've found or people find in the workspace or how they work that they think, you know, me personally as a designer or a creator of spaces and buildings should take on board? And, you know, sort of, you know, what are the sort of the key takeaways? How could I improve people's life within the office, other than maybe just, you know, work practices, but actually in the physical environment?
That's a really great question. One of the things that I'm always talking about is if you can get at least 20 minutes of light into your eyes before 3 o'clock in the day, that lifts your mood, improves your concentration across the board, men and women. So as an architect, I'm sure light is a really, really big thing for you. There's a lot of research that's says that being surrounded by green things, preferably growing things in a workspace, I saw, in fact, I think they've increased it actually over Christmas, can affect our mood and can be calming. And I think that's really important. Without going into too much information, as women get further through the menopause, their discomfort about needing to go to the toilet and needing to go quickly, whether that's because they've perhaps got problems with periods that are coming when they least expect it, or because they need to go to the toilet really quickly. So having access to female toilets that feel comfortable and safe, and they're not sort of 5 floors above them, would be an ideal answer. But I appreciate we can't always have everything that we want. And always having space to have a window that will open enough potentially to get a fresh draft or fresh breeze in without being accused of being the hot, sweaty woman in the corner. Please, none of you men ever put up with that cartoon that that you see that says the 7 dwarves of menopause. Itchy, bitchy, scratchy, you know, that kind of language has got to go, but sometimes it's still prevalent in workplaces where people are trying to make light of it and give out information in a nice way, and it ain't nice. So that, you know, within the workspace, that's a really great question. And the fact that you're even asking it is fantastic. Any other questions, comments that anybody would like to make? Nope. Well, I hope that this has been helpful. Judy and Joe and Beverly, thank you for coming. Mandy, I hope you've enjoyed it. And Nikki, those of you with the cameras off, I hope you found it helpful. Oh, Mandy's back. If you think of questions that you want to ask subsequent to this, girls, put them in the WhatsApp group, and I can either ask David or, you know, we can come back and we can do another one of these. This is groundbreaking stuff here, doing this kind of conversation with our other halves. So thank you to you, my lovely, for coming along and doing it. And thank you to all of you for coming along and listening. I hope that this opens a conversation for you to move forwards, and we can all have a good chat about it when we start again on our Monday session coming up soon. So thank you, everybody. I hope it's been helpful. I shall press unrecord